Organic gardening should be about improving soil health, encouraging biological diversity, and reducing off-farm inputs. Really, I would encourage you to not focus so much on becoming an organic gardener is using a product that has an organic label on it. It's really about being less dependent on chemical inputs and products that you have to purchase. Consuming less, using more local resources, trying to create more diversity in your garden, creating more habitat for beneficial wildlife. If you do have to use a pesticide, choose wisely and use it carefully. Think about long-term impacts.
Gardening was one of the activities that people turned to during the pandemic. And the K-State Garden Hour webinar series, hosted by K-State Research and Extension horticulture staff across the state, was started to offer tips and training. The webinar series is streamed live over the lunch hour the first and third Wednesday of each month. The fall series began August 4th and covered organic gardening. On today's Sound Living, creating organic systems. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman. Johnson County Horticulture Extension agent Zac Hoppenstedt says that there's an increased interest in organic gardening. During the hour-long webinar, he provided an introduction to organic agriculture and growing techniques adapted for the home garden. This week's Sound Living features some of the key points from that presentation.
And there seems to be a connection there with increasing consumer trends. So we've seen over the last 2 decades increased consumer demand for organic produce. It still makes up a relatively small percentage of the overall fruit and vegetable production industry, but steady growth and an industry that's worth over $8.5 billion. But if someone had to define in narrow terms what is organic agriculture, perhaps the easiest way of doing that would be saying that organic agriculture is defined by crop production that's done without synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, hormones, and does not allow for genetic modified organisms. And some of the techniques that are appropriate for commercial agriculture, organic agriculture, for market, there are some parallels to what can be done in the garden. But in many ways, organic gardening allows for greater opportunity to produce food in greater concert with the natural environment and to take even greater attention to detail and be less reliant on chemical inputs. Most gardeners are able, because of their smaller scale, to be observing more what's going on with their plants, provide more attention and care to individual plants, and are usually using a lower amount of chemical inputs than a commercial grower would, regardless of whether they are dedicated, unwavering, organic, or conventional. So some of the same practices that we preach, just good gardening practices, adding organic matter to the soil as a source of fertility and a way to promote good soil biology, which can buffer some soil-borne disease and pests, is definitely a good approach. So adding a lot of organic materials from plant or animal residues, compost, making your own compost. When we talk about minimizing off-farm inputs, compost is one of the best examples of that, because obviously you're recycling food waste from your home and plant residues from the garden, and you're using that to promote soil health and fertility for your plants. Looking at soil fertility, organic fertilizers are composed of natural materials, usually from animal or plant waste, sometimes mined minerals with little or no processing. Processed fertilizers are manufactured from refined or natural materials like rock or animal or petroleum products. These would be things like ammonium sulfate, ammonium phosphate, potassium sulfate, most of like urea, most of the widely available garden fertilizers. However, using an organic product brings more into the soil usually than just the macronutrient that the plant needs to grow. It's feeding the soil and bringing in some organic matter and has typically more biological activity to promote a diverse ecosystem in the soil. However, nitrogen is something that's sometimes difficult to get, and a lot of the soil samples that I see in my office coming from the northeast part of the state, we have lower levels of nitrogen because it's so mobile in the soil, whereas we have really high levels of phosphorus and potassium. And so just being mindful that even if you're selecting organic product like manure or compost, you may be accumulating higher levels of that P and K from the NPK rating that we get on most of our fertilizer bags. And the same way that we want to avoid excess fertilizers, excess nutrients in the soil, which lead to runoff and algae blooms in our water systems, those same negative impacts can come from adding excessive manures or compost year after year after year. So I really encourage even organic gardeners to submit a soil test to your local extension office. They usually can do that for low or no cost. Another way to promote fertility, to manage weeds, to prevent erosion, and even create living mulches are with cover crops. So cover crops are generally grass grain plant species, leguminous species that are grown to cover the soil during fallow periods, especially in late fall and through early spring, some that overwinter, some that are winter killed, like peas and oats, but that still provide a ground cover and then can be turned back into the soil, either with a broad fork or some light tillage to put that organic matter back in the soil. And with leguminous plants that have the ability to fix nitrogen, taking atmospheric nitrogen and converting that into plant available sources of nitrogen, that's free fertilizer that you really are just really growing in your garden through the use of cover crops. Biodiversity is important not only in trying to promote beneficial insects, but also really looking at the variety of crops that we grow in the garden. And if you tend to have a lot of pests and disease issues, you might consider trying to diversify the crop families that you're growing in your garden space. So realizing that there are botanical classifications of plant species and these plant families that make up a majority of the fruit and vegetables that we eat, there's a smaller subset of groups to which those plants fit into. And so things like, for example, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, all belonging to the nightshade family, or things like garlic, onions, leeks, shallots, all belonging to the onion family. Things like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, all being a part of a collective unit known as Brassicas or cruciferous vegetables. And a lot of the same diseases and pest pressures for broccoli are going to carry over into cabbage or kale. And so just being mindful that you're trying to rotate in between some of these different plant families. It's also really important to just select good plants. And so if you are a gardener that just has terrible issues with early blight or septoria on your tomatoes, it may not be the thing you want to hear, but the easiest thing to do would be to stop growing tomatoes and try growing, something with less disease pressure like sweet potatoes or lettuce. Another thing I'd highly recommend is take a look at recommended plant varieties from K-State, which are going to be locally adapted and proven high-yielding crop varieties for a variety of different fruit and vegetables. But really making sure that your plants have the basics that most, all plants need for healthy growth: soil, sunlight, water, and nutrients. If we keep the plants fertilized, we plant them into a weed-free environment, and we give them adequate space, and in some cases support like trellis, that really can go a long way to reducing our needs for inputs and being more organic. Understanding how to use different hand tools, when to use them, and getting weeds when they're small and can be easily disturbed and removed, and really starting to learn more about the difference in between when weed seeds germinate, making sure weeds don't go to flower, and seeing the difference between annual and perennial weeds. There are a few organic approved herbicides, but they're not hugely effective. And cultural practices like cultivating with a hand tool is sometimes your best option. Using mulches, using tarps to make your garden bed absent of light and to germinate seed underneath the tarp, and then to black out those plants so that they end up dying after germination, using silage tarps or solarization in some cases. can be effective at removing weed seed in the garden. And that's usually done with a clear plastic mulch. And so high temperatures are lethal to some weed species and not to others. So you have to be mindful and know what sort of weeds you're fighting and what the best approach is. Part of being an organic grower is really being curious and learning about the pest issues that you have on your farm so that you can pick the best approach. When it comes to diseases, cultural practices play a really large role as well. Just, making sure that you're picking disease-resistant varieties. If you have issues with powdery mildew on squash or cucumbers, making sure you're selecting varieties that have some resistance to powdery mildew. Understand the disease, its life cycle, when it's most prevalent in the environment, and where it's coming from. So, for example, with soil-borne diseases, doing some pruning at the base of the plant so that water splashing against the soil and hitting the foliage at the base of the plant, that you're reducing the environmental conditions that allow that to spread to your plant. Good plant spacing, planting, the timing of your planting, knowing what the appropriate air and soil temperatures are. For example, with tomatoes, we had, usually we'd be recommending that folks plant tomatoes in the northeast part of the state around Mother's Day. This year, it was far too cold to be putting out warm season plants at that time. And so holding back, knowing that nighttime temperatures were going to get far below 50 degrees several nights for multiple weeks, and waiting closer to the end of May puts a lot less stress on that plant early in its life. And generally that equates into a healthier plant for the rest of the season. A little bit more on some of the cultural interferences that can be done. Going out and scouting regularly, like I talked, and physical removal of insects can be really effective, especially if you can catch those populations early. Knocking off Japanese beetles into soapy water, going out and picking squash bugs. If you're in a small enough space, that can be an effective tool. The 2-brick method is what it's sometimes colloquially called. But then creating barriers is one of the most important tools that organic growers use. So that can be netting, that can be a clay dust product where it's a wettable powder that's sprayed on the surface of the apple fruits that creates a rough surface and can be prevented for both disease and insects if applied regularly. Using sticky traps or pheromone traps so that you can identify when the pests are becoming present in the garden. And then that is also an indicator. As soon as you know they're there, or the adults are there and that they might be laying eggs, then there are some really relatively low toxic inputs like insecticidal soaps or horticultural oils that really are only effective at the early stages of that pest's biological cycle. So in that way, using sticky traps both as a monitoring device, but also to capture and eliminate pests in the early stages. Strong spray of water, it kind of is contradictive to keeping the leaf surfaces dry. But what I would say is that if you can do a strong spray of water, especially early in the morning, where you give time for the leaf surfaces to dry out, that can be really effective on things like aphids and spider mites. And you may have to do that a few times, but it's definitely one of the more environmentally friendly ways to address those types of pests. There are 3 main points that I want you guys to walk away with. Organic gardening should be about improving soil health, encouraging biological diversity, and reducing off-farm inputs. Really, I would encourage you to not focus so much on becoming an organic gardener is using a product that has an organic label on it. It's really about being less dependent on chemical inputs and products that you have to purchase. Consuming less, using more local resources, trying to create more diversity in your garden, creating more habitat for beneficial wildlife. If you do have to use a pesticide, choose wisely and use it carefully. Think about long-term impacts.
That's Johnson County Horticulture Extension Agent Zac Hoppenstedt. To view his entire presentation or for more information on the K-State Garden Hour webinar series, visit the Horticulture and Natural Resources webpage, hnr.k-state.edu. Gardening and horticultural information is also available at local county and district extension offices. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman. and this is the K-State Radio Network.